How does a man forge an empire from the embers of a dead one? Not with gentle hands, but with a hammer. In the mid-8th century, the memory of Rome was a ghost, a half-forgotten dream of roads, laws, and legions. What remained was chaos, a fractured continent of petty kings, warring tribes, and a faith that was itself a battleground. Into this brutal twilight was born a boy named Charles. He was not destined for greatness by some divine prophecy. He would have to seize it. His world was Francia, a kingdom carved out by his grandfather, Charles Martel, the man who had halted the unstoppable tide of the Umayyad Caliphate at the Battle of Tours. But a kingdom saved is not a kingdom tamed. The court of his father, Pepin the Short, was a snake pit of ambition. Here, a whisper could be sharper than a sword, and loyalty was a currency traded for land and life. Charles learned his first lessons not in a classroom, but in the chilling silence that followed a rival's sudden disappearance. He learned that power did not flow from a crown. It was bled from the veins of your enemies, the Merovingian kings. The long-haired phantoms who supposedly ruled before his family were a cautionary tale. They had become puppets, symbols drained of all authority, paraded once a year before being locked away. Pepin, with the blessing of the Pope, had finally shaved the last one's head and sent him to a monastery, ending a dynasty not with a bang, but with the quiet snip of shears. It was a coup d'état sanctified by God's vicar on earth, a lesson in political theatre that Charles would never forget. He watched his father navigate the treacherous currents of Frankish nobility, a pack of wolves who would follow the strongest leader but would devour any who showed a moment's weakness. Survival was a daily struggle. What drives a man to not just survive such a world, but to conquer it? Is it a hunger for power, a fear of insignificance, or a vision of order so blinding that any price in blood seems small? For the young Charles, it was perhaps all three. He was a product of his time, large, physically imposing, restless, and possessed of a savage energy that seemed to shake the very ground he walked on. He was a barbarian, yes, but a barbarian who dreamed of Rome. His early years were a blur of campaigns alongside his father. He learned the brutal calculus of war, the speed of the march, the terror of the charge, the cold necessity of a scorched earth. He learned how to command men who were more loyal to their own greed than to any abstract concept of a kingdom. He learned that fear was a far more reliable tool than love. When Pepin died in 768, he followed Frankish tradition and split the kingdom between his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne. It was a recipe for civil war, a tradition that had torn Francia apart for generations. The two brothers were fire and ice. Charles was ambitious and decisive. Charlemagne was cautious and resentful. Their courts became rival centers of power, each attracting the vipers and malcontents who hoped to profit from the inevitable conflict. The air crackled with tension. Conspiracies were hatched in shadowed halls. Every border dispute, every minor slight, was a spark threatening to ignite the whole kingdom. In the 8th century, a crown was not inherited, it was taken. For 3 years, a fragile peace held, stretched thin by mutual hatred. Charlemagne blocked Charles's strategic marriage alliance with the Lombards, the rulers of northern Italy. Charles, in turn, campaigned without his brother's aid, proving he could win glory alone. History held its breath. The Frankish realm was a powder keg, and 2 royal hands held the torch. Then, in the year 771, fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, intervened. Charlemagne died suddenly. His wife and children, fearing for their lives, fled not to a convent, but to the court of the Lombard king Desiderius, Charles's new father-in-law and old enemy. The official chronicles are silent on the cause of Charlemagne's death, a silence that is itself a kind of scream. Charles did not wait for an invitation. He moved with lightning speed, disinheriting his young nephews and seizing his brother's lands. There was no noble assembly, no vote, no debate. There was only the swift, brutal assertion of will. In a matter of weeks, Charles was the sole king of the Franks. The wolves of the nobility, seeing a new Alpha, fell into line. The first obstacle to his ambition had not been overcome. It had been erased. The path was clear. But a united Francia was not an empire. It was merely a larger cage. Charles stood atop a hill of his own making, looking out at a world of enemies. To the north, the pagan Saxons sacrificed men to their forest gods. To the south, the sophisticated Lombards schemed with the Pope. To the west, the Britons of Armorica clung to their independence. To the far south, beyond the mountains, lay the glittering, hostile world of Al-Andalus. He was a king surrounded. For any other man, it would have been a nightmare. For Charles, it was an invitation. The era of consolidation was over. The age of conquest was about to begin. The man who would become Charlemagne was ready to build his world, and he would use the only tools he had ever trusted: fire, steel, and an unwavering belief in his own destiny. He was a king forged in chaos, and he was about to unleash a storm. What do you think was the primary motive for his ruthless consolidation of power, a necessary step to prevent civil war, or the cold ambition of a man who would let nothing stand in his way? Let us know if you see him as a ruthless pragmatist or a visionary monster. The ink was barely dry on the charters proclaiming him sole king of the Franks when Charles turned his gaze north, to the untamed wilderness of Saxony. This was not a land of cities and roads. It was a vast, dark forest, a mosaic of tribal lands bound by a common language and a visceral hatred of the Franks. The Saxons were a mirror image of what the Franks had once been: fierce, independent, pagan. They worshipped gods of war and nature in sacred groves, their most holy site centered around a great wooden pillar, the Irminsul, the pillar that they believed held up the sky. For decades, the border between Francia and Saxony had been a bleeding wound of raids and counter-raids. It was a nuisance, a drain on resources, but for Charles it was something more. It was an ideological affront, a pagan cancer on the border of his Christian kingdom. He would not contain it, he would excise it. In the summer of 772, he launched his first campaign. This was not to be a war of borders, it was to be a war of conversion. He marched his army into the heart of their territory, his target not a fortress, but a soul. He captured the Eresburg fortress and then pushed on to the site of the Irminsul. His soldiers hacked down the sacred pillar, looted the temple's gold and burned the grove to the ground. It was a declaration. He was not just attacking their warriors, he was attacking their gods. He offered the Saxons a choice between baptism and burial and often provided both. This single act of sacrilege ignited a fire that would burn for more than 30 years. The Saxon Wars were not a conflict, they were an ordeal. A relentless, grinding campaign of seasonal annihilation. Every spring, the Frankish army would march into Saxony. They would burn the villages, destroy the crops, and slaughter anyone who resisted. They would force mass baptisms in the rivers, the sword point of a Frankish warrior serving as the ultimate theological argument. And every winter, when the army withdrew, the Saxons would rise up again. They would renounce their new faith, rebuild their altars, and pour across the border, exacting a bloody revenge on Frankish settlements and churches. It was a vicious, unbreakable cycle. The Saxons had found a leader worthy of their defiance, a nobleman named Widukind. He was not a king, but a war leader, a ghost who materialized out of the forests to lead devastating guerrilla attacks, only to vanish back into the swamps and woods before the cumbersome Frankish host could pin him down. Widukind became Charles's obsession, the living embodiment of Saxon resistance. For years, the two men engaged in a deadly continental game of cat and mouse. Charles would build fortresses, Widukind would burn them. Charles would install priests, Widukind would hang them. The war devolved into a level of savagery that shocked even that brutal age. Frustration mounted in the Frankish camp. This was not a war against a conventional army that could be met and defeated in a single, decisive battle. It was a war against a people, a culture, a landscape. Charles's response was to escalate the terror. He began a policy of mass deportations, uprooting entire Saxon communities and resettling them in Francia, replacing them with loyal Frankish colonists. He issued the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a code of law that made pagan practices punishable by death. Refusing baptism was a capital crime. Observing pagan rites was a capital crime. Criticizing a priest was a capital crime. It was a legal framework for genocide. The grim apex of this policy came in the year 782. After Widukind had once again incited a massive rebellion and annihilated a Frankish army near the Suntel Mountains, Charles's patience finally broke. He marched to Verdun on the Aller River and demanded the surrender of the warriors responsible. The Saxon chieftains, facing the annihilation of their people, complied. They handed over 4,500 of their own men. Charles had them all beheaded in a single day. The river ran red. The massacre of Verdun was not an act of war. It was an act of state-sponsored terror. It was meant to break the Saxon will forever, to show them that their god of the forest was no match for his god of armies. But it didn't work. The massacre, intended to end the war, instead fueled its most desperate phase. Widukind, who had escaped to the Danes, returned, and the Saxon fury reached a fever pitch. The war raged for 3 more bloody years, but the sheer weight of Frankish resources was too much. The Saxons were being systematically exterminated, their land colonized, their culture erased. In 785, facing the total destruction of his people, Widukind finally surrendered. He accepted baptism, with Charles himself standing as his godfather. It was a monumental act of political theatre. The great rebel had bent the knee. For Charles, it was the symbolic culmination of his holy war. The war would flare up again in the years to come, but the heart of the resistance had been ripped out. The 30-year struggle had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and laid waste to an entire region. To build his Christian empire, Charles was willing to create a pagan hell. He had secured his northern frontier through a policy of unrelenting brutality. The hammer of the Franks had fallen, and an entire people had been broken on the anvil of his will. The forests of Saxony were finally quiet, but it was the quiet of a graveyard. And with the north finally subdued, a new call for help, a new opportunity for conquest echoed from across the snowy peaks of the Alps. The Pope in Rome had enemies, and he needed a protector with a very large army. Charles, King of the Franks, had spent a generation pacifying the north with a brute force approach. The Saxon lands were a smouldering ruin, a testament to his unrelenting will. But the summons from the south required a different kind of strategy. This was not a war against forest tribes. This was a confrontation with a sophisticated kingdom, a rival power with a claim to the legacy of Rome itself. The Lombards, a Germanic people who had ruled most of Italy for 2 centuries, were pressing down on the territories of the Pope. King Desiderius, a cunning and ambitious ruler, saw the papacy as just another piece on the Italian chessboard, a piece he intended to capture. Pope Adrian I, a man caught between the Lombard hammer and the Byzantine anvil in southern Italy, saw only one hope for survival. He sent desperate messages across the Alps, appealing to the new master of the north, the pious and formidable King of the Franks. It was an invitation Charles could not refuse. He was the sworn protector of the Church, a title inherited from his father. But more than that, it was a golden opportunity. Italy was the heart of the old empire. To control Italy was to control the Pope, and to control the Pope was to hold the keys to a legitimacy no barbarian king had ever possessed. Yet there was a complication, a deeply personal one. Charles was married to the daughter of Desiderius, the Lombard king. His own wife was the child of the man he was about to destroy. In a move of cold political calculation, he repudiated her, sending her back to the Lombard court in disgrace. The family alliance was severed. The path to war was now clear. He had used the marriage to neutralize a potential threat while he dealt with the Saxons. Now that it was an inconvenience, he discarded it. In the autumn of 773, Charles assembled his host. The challenge was immense. Desiderius controlled the mountain passes, the traditional gateways into Italy. He had fortified them, believing no army could force its way through. He expected a long, drawn-out confrontation at the border. He underestimated Charles. Charles was not just a brute, he was a brilliant strategist. He did what his enemies least expected. He split his army. While one force feigned a direct assault on the main pass, Charles, leading the other half of the army, took an obscure, treacherous path, guided by locals loyal to the Pope. It was a gamble of epic proportions. His men marched through desolate, snow-choked mountain trails, dragging their equipment over terrain thought impassable for an organized army. It was a logistical nightmare, a test of sheer endurance. But it worked. Desiderius, waiting for a frontal assault, suddenly received the terrifying news that a massive Frankish army had appeared in his rear, descending into the plains of Lombardy as if from the sky. The Lombard defenses, so carefully prepared, were now useless. Their lines collapsed. Desiderius and his court panicked and fell back to his capital, Pavia, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. The chase was on. The Frankish cavalry, hard-bitten veterans of a dozen campaigns, thundered across northern Italy. City after city opened its gates to Charles. He was not just a conqueror, he was hailed as a liberator sent by the Pope. The siege of Pavia began. This was not a Saxon hill fort. It was a city with massive stone walls, deep moats, and vast stores of food and water. A direct assault was impossible. Charles settled in for a long siege, a war of attrition. He surrounded the city, building a ring of fortifications to starve it into submission. But while his army waited, Charles did not. He left his uncle, Bernard, to manage the siege and took a detachment of elite troops on a stunning tour of his new domain. He marched through central Italy, securing the allegiance of cities like Spoleto and Rieti. His destination was Rome. In the spring of 774, for the first time in his life, Charles entered the Eternal City. It was a moment of profound significance. The barbarian king from the north, the heir of warlords who had sacked this very city, now entered as its protector. He was greeted as a hero. Pope Adrian received him with the highest honors, and for days the king toured the holy sites, praying at the tombs of the apostles. But this was more than a pilgrimage. It was a political masterstroke. In the Basilica of St. Peter, Charles knelt and confirmed his father's promise to protect the papacy, the so-called Donation of Pepin, which became the legal foundation for the Papal States. He was creating a new political order, a papal kingdom in central Italy, guaranteed and protected by Frankish steel. He was binding the destiny of his dynasty to the destiny of the Roman Church. Meanwhile, back in Pavia, the siege dragged on. 9 months passed. Inside the walls, starvation and disease were rampant. The will of the defenders was broken. In June of 774, King Desiderius surrendered. He was not executed. Charles, in a rare act of what might be considered mercy, simply had his head shaved and sent him to a Frankish monastery to live out his days. His son, who had held out in Verona, had already fled to Constantinople. The Lombard kingdom was finished. Charles entered the fallen capital and, in a ceremony of immense symbolism, crowned himself with the ancient iron crown of Lombardy, a relic said to contain a nail from the true cross. He was now Charles, king of the Franks and the Lombards. He had conquered a kingdom in less than a year, outmaneuvering and outthinking a powerful rival. The Italian campaign was a masterpiece of speed, deception, and political acumen. It established him as the undisputed master of Western Europe and the indispensable ally of the Pope. But power, once tasted, only creates a thirst for more. With the north and south of his growing realm seemingly secure, Charles turned his gaze to a new frontier, a land of mountains and deserts, of fabled cities and a rival faith. He looked beyond the Pyrenees to the rich and fractured emirates of Muslim Spain. The conquest of Italy had been a masterclass in strategy. The Saxon Wars were a testament to brutal perseverance. But the next campaign would be a lesson in a different kind of war, a war of shadows, betrayal, and the bitter taste of defeat. Beyond the formidable barrier of the Pyrenees lay Al-Andalus, the jewel of the Umayyad Caliphate. For decades, it had been a source of anxiety for the Franks, a powerful Islamic state on their southern border. But in the late 770s, Al-Andalus was not united. The emir of Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman I, was struggling to suppress rebellious local governors. In 777, a delegation of these discontented Muslim rulers from the north of Spain arrived at Charles's court in Paderborn. They offered him a tantalizing deal. They would swear allegiance to him and open the gates of their cities, including the great fortress of Zaragoza, if he would help them overthrow the emir of Córdoba. It was an irresistible offer. The chance to create a buffer state, a Spanish march on his southern border, and to expand Christian territory at the expense of Islam was too good to pass up. It seemed like a replay of the Lombard campaign, a swift intervention at the invitation of a local faction. In the spring of 778, Charles gathered one of the largest armies he had ever commanded and marched south. Like Hannibal in reverse, he crossed the Pyrenees. The campaign began well. The Christian Basques of the mountains were subdued and the city of Pamplona was taken. Charles's army advanced deep into Spain, arriving before the walls of Zaragoza, the prize he had been promised. And then the plan fell apart. The gates did not open. The rebellious governor, having perhaps second thoughts about inviting the rapacious Franks into his land, refused to honor the agreement. Zaragoza was too strong to be taken by storm, and Charles was not equipped for a long siege so deep in enemy territory. The entire premise of the campaign had evaporated. To make matters worse, news arrived that the Saxons, predictably, had revolted once again in his absence. Betrayed and overextended, Charles had no choice but to cut his losses and retreat. He took hostages from the governor of Zaragoza to ensure his withdrawal would not be harassed, and then ordered the march back to Francia. He had the walls of the Christian city of Pamplona torn down, an act of spite to ensure the Basques could not use it as a base to defy him in the future. It was a move that would have fatal consequences. The retreat began. The vast Frankish army, laden with plunder, snaked its way back through the high passes of the Pyrenees. The mood was grim. The campaign had been a costly failure, a blow to the king's prestige. The main body of the army, with Charles at its head, moved through the valleys while a strong rearguard, commanded by some of his most trusted lieutenants, protected the baggage train. Among these commanders was a man named Hrudland, the warden of the Breton March, better known to history as Roland. As the rearguard entered the narrow defile of Roncevaux Pass, the trap was sprung. But the attackers were not the Saracens of Zaragoza. They were the Basques, enraged by the destruction of Pamplona. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, they rained down boulders and arrows from the cliffs above, turning the narrow pass into a death trap. The heavily armored Franks, caught in the open and unable to maneuver, were helpless. It was a slaughter. The Basques swarmed down the slopes, overwhelming the rearguard, killing every last man and looting the baggage train before melting back into the mountains. Roland, the hero of 1,000 future poems, fell alongside the rest of Charles's trusted companions. By the time Charles, alerted to the disaster, turned the main army around, it was too late. The attackers were gone. All he found was the silence of the dead. The Roncevaux Pass disaster was a shocking military humiliation. It was a minor skirmish in the grand scheme of his reign, but it was a deeply personal one. He had lost his friends, his best men, to an enemy he had provoked and underestimated. Charles's own biographer, Einhard, barely mentions the event, glossing over it as a minor setback. The official chronicles of the kingdom tried to bury it, but history has a strange way of remembering. This inglorious defeat, this bloody rout in a mountain pass, refused to be forgotten. Over the next 3 centuries, through the songs of minstrels and poets, the story was transformed. The treacherous Basque ambush became a heroic last stand against a massive Saracen army. The small rearguard became a band of superhuman Christian knights, and Roland, the obscure border count, became the paragon of chivalry, the nephew of the emperor, who blew his oliphant horn to summon aid until his temples burst. The disaster was laundered into a myth, the Song of Roland, the foundational epic of French literature. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, turning a tale of failure and revenge into a glorious story of faith, loyalty, and noble sacrifice. Charles learned a valuable lesson at Roncevaux. Not every battle could be won with the sword. Sometimes the most powerful weapon was the story you told afterward. Do you believe the legend of Roland was a cynical act of state propaganda to cover a defeat, or a natural evolution of storytelling that gave meaning to a tragic loss? Tell us if you think Charles was a masterful propagandist or a man in genuine grief. The disaster at Roncevaux was a sting, a painful reminder of his own fallibility. Yet in the grand calculus of power, it was a footnote. Charles returned from Spain and, with characteristic energy, threw himself back into the Saxon meat grinder, putting down the rebellion that had flared in his absence. He was a man who learned from his mistakes. He established a fortified buffer zone, the Spanish March, which would slowly, over centuries, evolve into Catalonia. He never again attempted such a reckless invasion of the south. His focus shifted. The conquests had created a vast domain, stretching from the North Sea to central Italy, from the Atlantic to the plains of Pannonia. He was not merely a king anymore, he was something more. He was the de facto ruler of the West. But his title, King of the Franks and Lombards, felt inadequate. It was a barbarian title, a relic of a fragmented world. He ruled a territory that rivaled the old Western Roman Empire in size. He commanded an army that no power on earth could match. He was the sworn protector of the Pope. He was, in all but name, an emperor. And in Rome, the Pope, the man who held the keys to that ultimate title, was in desperate trouble. Pope Leo III was not a popular man. Accused by the Roman aristocracy of perjury and adultery, he was ambushed in the streets of Rome in the year 799. His enemies tried to blind him and cut out his tongue, the traditional Byzantine punishment for a deposed ruler. They left him for dead. But Leo, miraculously or through sheer luck, survived and escaped. He fled Rome and made the arduous journey across the Alps to Paderborn to throw himself at the feet of the only man who could save him, Charles. It was a moment pregnant with possibility. The Pope, the spiritual head of Western Christendom, arrived as a mutilated fugitive, begging for the protection of a secular king. It was a stark demonstration of where true power now lay. Charles received Leo with all the honors due his office, but he understood the leverage he now possessed. He listened to the Pope's story and to the accusations of the Roman nobles who followed him. He was being asked to judge the vicar of Christ. It was an unprecedented position for a Germanic king. After months of deliberation, Charles made his decision. He would go to Rome himself. He would restore the Pope and settle the matter. In the late autumn of the year 800, Charles entered the Eternal City, not as a pilgrim this time, but as a judge and arbiter. A great synod was convened, but no one dared to pass judgment on the Pope. Instead, Leo was allowed to clear his name by swearing an oath of innocence on the Gospels. The rebellion was crushed. The Pope was restored to his throne, his authority re-established entirely by the will and military might of the Frankish king. The stage was set. Christmas Day, the year 800. St. Peter's Basilica was filled to capacity. Charles, dressed in the robes of a Roman patrician, knelt in prayer before the high altar. As he rose, Pope Leo stepped forward, seemingly unexpectedly, and placed a golden crown upon his head. The choir and the people of Rome, prompted by the Pope's allies, roared their acclamation to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans. Life and victory. In that single theatrical moment, history pivoted. 324 years after the last Roman emperor in the West had been deposed, the title was reborn. Charles, the Germanic warlord, the grandson of a barbarian chief, was now a Roman emperor. But was it truly a surprise? Einhard, Charles's biographer, claims the king was so displeased that he said he would never have entered the church that day had he known the Pope's plan. This is almost certainly a calculated fiction. The coronation was too well staged, the acclamation too well rehearsed to have been spontaneous. It was a brilliant political pact. The Pope, by crowning the emperor, asserted the spiritual authority to create secular rulers, placing the church above the state. Charles, by accepting the crown, gained ultimate prestige and a title that placed him on equal footing with the emperor in Constantinople, who now viewed him as a barbarian usurper. It was a declaration of independence for the West. No longer would it be a chaotic frontier of the true Roman Empire in the East. It was now its own empire, with its own emperor, sanctioned by its own spiritual leader. The act was a shockwave across the Mediterranean. In Constantinople, they were outraged. In the Islamic world, they took note. A new superpower had been formally born. Charles, now Charlemagne or Charles the Great, had reached the apex of his power. He had conquered kingdoms, subjugated peoples, and now he had resurrected the most potent political idea in European history. He had the title, the territory, and the army. But he understood with a clarity that few rulers possess that an empire cannot be held together by the sword alone. An empire needs a soul. It needs a common language, a common culture, a common way of thinking. His next war would not be fought on the battlefield. It would be fought in the scriptorium, in the classroom, and in the minds of his subjects. The emperor of soldiers was about to become an emperor of ideas. An empire forged in blood must be sustained by more than just fear. Charlemagne, the newly crowned Roman emperor, stood astride a colossal, unwieldy territory. He ruled over Franks, Lombards, Saxons, Bavarians, Avars, and dozens of other peoples, each with their own laws, customs, and languages. The imperial title was a magnificent cloak, but the body beneath was a patchwork of brutal, semi-literate warrior cultures. Charlemagne knew that military conquest was the easy part. The true challenge was to govern. How do you administer justice, collect taxes, and issue decrees across a continent when most of your administrators can barely read the orders you send them? How do you foster a common identity among people who see each other as foreigners and enemies? His solution was as audacious as any of his military campaigns. He would launch a revolution of the mind, a war against ignorance. This cultural rebirth, which historians would later call the Carolingian Renaissance, was not born from a love of art for art's sake. It was a deeply pragmatic project, a matter of state security. To run an empire, you need a bureaucracy. To have a bureaucracy, you need literate officials. To have literate officials, you need schools. And to have schools, you need books and teachers. At that time, Europe was in the grip of a dark age of knowledge. The great libraries of the ancient world were gone. Texts had been lost or corrupted through centuries of sloppy copying by semi-literate monks. Latin, the universal language of the church and administration, had degraded into a multitude of local vernaculars. A priest in Italy could barely understand a priest from Francia. The intellectual infrastructure of civilization was crumbling. Charlemagne decided to rebuild it. He may have been only semi-literate himself. He could read, but struggled to write, famously keeping tablets under his pillow to practice his letters at night. But he had a profound respect for learning. He began to use his immense wealth and authority to scour Europe for the greatest minds of his generation. He recruited scholars from every corner of his empire and beyond, drawing them to his new capital at Aachen with promises of patronage and a grand purpose. From Anglo-Saxon England came Alcuin of York, a brilliant theologian and educator who would become the architect of the reforms. From Italy came Paul the Deacon, the historian of the Lombards, and Peter of Pisa, the grammarian. From Visigothic Spain came the poet, Théodulph of Orléans. This diverse army of scholars became Charlemagne's intellectual general staff. Under the direction of Alcuin, a comprehensive educational reform was launched. Decrees were sent out ordering every cathedral and monastery to establish a school for the training of clergy and, in some cases, the sons of nobility. The curriculum was standardized based on the classical Roman model of the 7 liberal arts. It was a systematic effort to create a new, educated elite to serve both church and empire. One of the most critical and lasting innovations of this period was the reform of handwriting. The scripts used across Europe were a chaotic mess of regional styles, often difficult to read and prone to error. In the scriptoria of monasteries like Corbie and Tours, a new script was developed and promoted. It was clear, simple, and elegant, with distinct upper and lower case forms. We call it Carolingian minuscule. It was so legible and efficient that the humanists of the Italian Renaissance would later adopt it, mistakenly believing it to be the authentic script of ancient Rome. From there, it became the basis for our modern lowercase alphabet. Nearly every book you read today is printed in a font that is a direct descendant of a script created by Charlemagne's scholars. This parchment revolution was a Herculean task. The emperor's agents were dispatched to the farthest corners of Christendom to hunt for and borrow precious manuscripts. In the monastic scriptoria, an army of scribes began the titanic work of copying them. They preserved the works of the Church Fathers, but also the writings of pagan Roman authors like Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero. It is no exaggeration to say that the vast majority of classical Latin literature that survives today does so because a Carolingian scribe copied it. Without this effort, the intellectual heritage of Rome might have been lost forever. Charlemagne's court at Aachen became a vibrant center of culture. He commissioned palaces and chapels built in a style that consciously emulated Roman and Byzantine architecture, a statement in stone of his imperial ambitions. He delighted in intellectual debate, gathering his scholars around him to discuss theology, astronomy, and poetry. This was more than a hobby, it was a demonstration that the new Roman Empire was not just a military power, but a civilization. The war against ignorance was a long, grinding campaign, just like the war against the Saxons. But its victories were not measured in fortified towns, but in preserved texts. Its heroes were not warriors, but monks bent over desks with a quill in their hand. Charlemagne understood that an empire built only on fear will crumble the moment the emperor's back is turned. An empire built on a shared idea, a common culture, has a chance to endure. He was forging a new European identity in the fires of both the battlefield and the scriptorium. Yet, while he was busy saving the wisdom of the past, the most immediate threats to his creation were not ignorant barbarians at the gates, but ambitious vipers within his own house. The grand imperial project, the revival of Roman glory, the renaissance of learning, was a magnificent facade. Behind the soaring arches of Aachen's palace chapel, a darker drama was unfolding. An empire the size of Charlemagne's was not a machine, it was a beast, and it required constant caging. Its sheer scale created immense problems of control. Local dukes and counts far from the emperor's eye ruled their territories like personal fiefdoms, their loyalty always in question. But the most venomous threats came not from the periphery, but from the very heart of the court. The emperor, the symbol of absolute power, found himself enmeshed in a web of conspiracies, rebellions, and family dramas that threatened to tear his life's work apart. The first and most painful betrayal came from his own blood. Pepin the Hunchback was Charlemagne's eldest son, born to a concubine before his official marriages. A physical deformity made him an unlikely candidate to inherit the warrior kingdom of the Franks, and after Charlemagne legitimized his sons by his wife Hildegard, Pepin's status became dangerously ambiguous. He was a prince with no prospect of a throne, a focal point for every discontented nobleman in the realm. In 792, a conspiracy was uncovered. A group of powerful Frankish aristocrats, resentful of the emperor's centralized power, planned to assassinate Charlemagne and his legitimate sons and place Pepin the Hunchback on the throne. The plot was discovered just in time. The conspirators were rounded up, tried, and brutally executed. Some were hanged, others blinded. As for his son, Charlemagne could not bring himself to execute him. Instead, he had Pepin's head shaved and exiled him to a monastery where he would live out the rest of his days. The father had become a jailer to his son. Could you imagine a more bitter choice, to condemn your own child to a living death to save your empire? This was not an isolated incident. The empire was held together by a system of personal oaths, and such oaths could be broken. Rebellions flared up constantly. The subjugated peoples, the Saxons, the Lombards, the Bavarians, rose up whenever they sensed a moment of weakness. Duke Tassilo of Bavaria, Charlemagne's own cousin, was caught intriguing with the hostile Avars and Lombards. He was put on trial, forced to confess to treason, and, like Pepin, tonsured and packed off to a monastic prison. The emperor's justice was swift and unforgiving. He was creating order, but the price of that order was a climate of fear and paranoia. The political purges were relentless. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was stripped of their lands and titles, their families disgraced. The court at Aachen, for all its intellectual vibrancy, was also a place of whispers and spies, where every ambitious man watched his rivals and his back. Charlemagne's own family life was a source of constant instability. He had multiple wives and concubines, producing a small army of children. Officially, he had at least 18. His sons, Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis the Pious, were made sub-kings of various parts of the empire during his lifetime. It was a strategy to train them in governance, but it also created rival power centers. The brothers were jealous of one another, each building their own courts and warrior followings. While their father lived, his immense authority kept their ambitions in check. But they were already maneuvering, forging alliances, and eyeing the inheritance they would one day fight over. A man who creates an empire but cannot control his own family is the architect of his own ruin. His daughters presented a different kind of problem. They were intelligent, beautiful, and of immense strategic value on the European marriage market. Yet Charlemagne refused to let any of them marry. He kept them at court, showering them with affection, but denying them the traditional role of a princess. The official reason was that he loved them too much to part with them. The political reality was that any man who married one of his daughters would gain a potential claim to the throne, creating a son-in-law who might become a dangerous rival. He neutralized this threat, but in doing so, created a scandal. His unmarried daughters took lovers from among the court aristocrats, bearing illegitimate children within the supposedly pious confines of the imperial palace. The emperor, who imposed strict moral laws on his subjects, turned a blind eye to the conduct of his own family. The splendor of the empire barely concealed the rot of human ambition and weakness at its core. Charlemagne, the great lawgiver, the restorer of order, was forced to act like a paranoid tyrant, crushing dissent, imprisoning relatives, and constantly fighting to hold his vast creation together. He had caged the lions of Europe, but now he was trapped in the cage with them. And as he grew older, consumed by the struggles within, a new threat was gathering on the horizon, a menace from the sea against which his massive land armies would be all but useless. What do you think drove Charlemagne's harsh treatment of internal dissent? The necessary, brutal calculus of a ruler holding a fragile empire together, or the growing paranoia of an aging autocrat? Was it a necessary evil, or the action of a tyrant? The latter years of the 8th century brought a false dawn of stability to Charlemagne's empire. The Saxon Wars were finally sputtering to a close. The Avars, a fearsome nomadic power on his eastern frontier, had been crushed, and their legendary treasure hoard looted. The internal conspiracies had been stamped out with brutal efficiency. The emperor, now in his 50s, could survey a realm at peace, an empire seemingly secure within its borders. He had built a fortress of order in a world of chaos. But he had built it to fight the enemies he knew, rival kingdoms, rebellious tribes, scheming nobles. He was not prepared for the enemy that came next. He was not prepared for the dragons. They came from the north, from the splintered kingdoms of Scandinavia. We call them Vikings. To the Franks, they were simply the Northmen, a terrifying new breed of pagan pirate. Their ships were technological marvels. Long, sleek, with a shallow draft, the longship could navigate both the open ocean and the shallowest of rivers. It could appear without warning from the sea, strike deep into the heartland of the empire, and vanish with its plunder before a defense could be mustered. They were a threat for which the slow, ponderous Frankish military machine had no answer. The first recorded raid on the Frankish coast came in the year 799, when Northmen sacked a monastery on an island off the coast of Aquitaine. It was a minor event, a pinprick, but it was a harbinger. In the following years, the attacks grew more frequent, more audacious. Monasteries, rich with gold and silver, and defended only by unarmed monks, were their favourite targets. The great abbey of Lindisfarne in Northumbria had already been sacked in 793, sending a shockwave of terror throughout Christendom. Now that terror had come to Francia. The chroniclers of the time described the panic and despair. These were not conventional warriors. They fought with a berserker fury, seemed immune to fear, and had no respect for the sanctity of a church. They killed priests at the altar, enslaved entire communities, and burned what they could not carry. To the Franks, they seemed not human, but a divine punishment, a plague of demons sent by God to chastise a sinful people. Charlemagne, the old warrior, saw the threat with terrifying clarity. A story recorded by a later monk tells of the emperor, now an old man, visiting a port in the south of his empire. He saw the long ships of Northman pirates who had dared to enter the harbour. His own men thought they were merchants, but Charlemagne recognized them for what they were. He stood at the window for a long time, the chronicler says, weeping uncontrollably. He was not afraid of them for himself, he explained to his court. He wept for his descendants and for the people of his empire, who he knew would suffer terribly from this new scourge. The man who had never shown fear in the face of entire armies wept at the sight of a few pirate ships. He knew he was looking at the future. He was a man of the land. His power was in his heavy cavalry, his legions of infantry, his siege engines. These were useless against an enemy who came from the sea, who struck like lightning and disappeared into the mist. He did what he could. He ordered the construction of a coastal defense fleet, the building of watchtowers, and the garrisoning of river mouths. It was the right strategy, but it was too little, too late. The empire's coastline was immense, impossible to defend everywhere at once. And building a navy from scratch was a generational task. He had spent his life looking east, south, and inward. The threat from the north had been unimaginable. The appearance of the Vikings was more than just a military problem. It was a psychological blow. It revealed the fundamental fragility of the Carolingian peace. The empire was a giant, powerful and magnificent, but a giant with a soft underbelly. The Northmen exposed the limits of Charlemagne's power. He could defeat any army that stood against him on the field of battle, but he could not stop the raids. He could not be everywhere at once. The terror of the long ships was a foreboding of the chaos that was to come, a sign that the order he had imposed on the continent was a temporary, artificial construct held together by his will alone. As he entered the last decade of his life, the emperor was a man beset by anxieties. The internal threats of rebellion had been replaced by an external threat he could not counter. His body was beginning to fail him, and the most pressing question of all loomed ever larger. What would happen to his great creation when he was gone? The dragons from the sea were a terrifying omen. They were the harbingers of a new age of chaos, a storm that his heirs, he feared, would not be strong enough to weather. The great emperor had met an enemy that could not be conquered, only endured, and time, he knew, was no longer on his side. The final years of a great man's life are often a race against time, a desperate attempt to solidify a legacy against the coming tide of mortality. For Charlemagne, the patriarch of the West, his last decade was a long, slow winter. The boundless energy that had driven him across a continent for 50 years was finally beginning to wane. He was now in his 60s, an old man by the standards of his age. Gout racked his joints, and fevers came more frequently. He still hunted, still rode, still projected an aura of immense authority, but the effort was greater. The man who had seemed like a force of nature was now subject to its inevitable laws. The empire, his life's work, was a colossal but fragile edifice, and he was its only keystone. He knew this. The fear of what would come after his death haunted him. His solution had been the traditional Frankish one, to divide the empire among his legitimate sons. In 806, he drew up the Divisio Regnorum, a formal plan for the succession. The empire would be partitioned between Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis the Pious. It was a pragmatic plan designed to give each son a viable kingdom and prevent the civil war he knew was likely. But fate had other plans. It is a cruel irony of history that a man who fathered so many children would be left with a crisis of inheritance. The first blow came in 810. His son Pepin, king of Italy, the conqueror of the Avars, died of a fever. Charlemagne was devastated. He had lost not just a son, but a capable and proven ruler. The next year, the tragedy compounded. His eldest and favorite son, Charles the Younger, the one he had designated to inherit the imperial heartland of Francia and Saxony, also died. The emperor, the man of iron, was now a grieving father, twice over. Of his 3 legitimate heirs, only one remained, Louis the Pious, king of Aquitaine. He was a stark contrast to his father. Where Charlemagne was pragmatic, gregarious, and ruthless, Louis was scholarly, intensely devout, and indecisive. He was a man more suited to the monastery than the throne room of a sprawling, violent empire. But he was all that was left. The grand plan for a managed division of the empire was in ashes. The entire indivisible inheritance would now fall to a son who, Charlemagne feared, lacked the iron will to hold it. In 813, the emperor, feeling his own end approaching, summoned Louis to Aachen. In a solemn ceremony before the assembled nobility of the empire, Charlemagne himself placed the imperial crown on his son's head, making him co-emperor. It was a significant act. He was not letting the Pope do it this time. He was demonstrating that the imperial authority now flowed from his dynasty, not from Rome. He was trying, in one last, desperate act, to secure the future, to see beyond his own death and ensure a smooth transition. He spent his final months putting his affairs in order. He issued final decrees, sent envoys to foreign courts, and gave vast sums to the church. He corrected the texts of the Gospels, as if trying to ensure the word of God was as orderly as he had tried to make the world of men. The man who became a legend in his own lifetime was preparing to meet the only master he had ever acknowledged. The winter of 814 was harsh. The emperor was struck by a high fever. He took to his bed in the palace at Aachen. For 7 days he refused food and drink, succumbing to the pleurisy that was consuming him. On the morning of January 28th, he died. The giant was gone. The force that had bent a continent to its will was extinguished. They buried him in the chapel he had built, seating his embalmed body on a throne, dressed in his imperial robes, a sword across his lap, and a copy of the Gospels on his knees. He was buried as he had lived, an emperor, a Christian, and a warrior. But a dead emperor cannot command loyalty. A ghost cannot lead an army. The keystone had been removed, and the arch of the empire began to tremble. The immense centralized power that had been Charlemagne's personal creation was about to be tested by the centrifugal forces of regional ambition, ethnic division, and the simple, ravenous greed of his own descendants. His winter had ended. A long, bloody winter for his empire was just beginning. The death of a great ruler is often followed not by silence, but by the sound of sharpening knives. When Charlemagne died, the empire he had built by force of will did not collapse overnight. It began to decay, to crumble from within. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited a united realm, but lacked the fearsome authority to command it. His own piety became a weakness. He purged his father's court of its more worldly and corrupt elements, but in doing so he alienated powerful figures. His attempts to reform the church and the state were met with sullen resistance from a nobility that had only ever respected the iron fist of his father. The empire was held together by personal loyalties, and Louis could not command the same fear or devotion. The real trouble, however, began with his own sons. Like Charlemagne before him, Louis had three heirs: Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German. Unlike the generation before them, they were consumed by ambition and jealousy. They saw their father's weakness as their opportunity. For 2 decades, the empire was racked by a series of sordid and brutal civil wars. The sons rebelled against the father. They fought each other. They deposed Louis, humiliated him, and then, finding they could not rule without him, restored him to the throne. It was a pathetic spectacle that stripped the imperial title of its majesty and bled the empire of its strength. When Louis the Pious finally died in 840, the gloves came off entirely. His 3 surviving sons, Pepin of Aquitaine had died, launched into a final, devastating war for the inheritance. The climax came at the Battle of Fontenoy in 841, a slaughter so immense that it wiped out a generation of the Frankish nobility and broke the military backbone of the empire. Recognizing that none of them could win a decisive victory, the 3 brothers finally met to make a lasting peace. At Verdun, in the year 843, they signed a treaty. This was not a will or a decree, it was the official death certificate of Charlemagne's united empire. The Treaty of Verdun partitioned the realm into 3 new kingdoms. Charles the Bald took West Francia, the territory that would eventually become France. Louis the German took East Francia, the lands that would form the nucleus of Germany. And Lothair, the eldest, took the imperial title and a long, awkward middle kingdom, stretching from the North Sea down to Italy, a strip of land with no natural or ethnic cohesion that would be a battleground for the next 1,000 years. From the ruins of one great empire, the embryos of the modern nations of Europe were born. Charlemagne's dream of a single, unified Christian state was dead less than 30 years after his own death. The Vikings he had so feared now raided with impunity, sailing up the Seine to besiege Paris itself. The Muslims renewed their attacks from the south, and the Magyars, a new terror from the east, began their devastating raids. The Carolingian order collapsed back into the chaos from which it had been born. Was it all for nothing? Was the blood, the conquest, the 30-year Saxon War, the Parchment Revolution, all just the fleeting ambition of one man, doomed to vanish like breath on a cold day? No. The political entity of his empire was gone, but the idea he had unleashed upon the world was indestructible, the idea of Europe. Before Charlemagne, there was no concept of a unified European civilization. There were Franks, Lombards, Goths, Romans. He, through conquest and culture, had hammered these disparate peoples into a single Christian commonwealth. He gave them a common identity, a common faith, and a shared memory of Roman order. The memory of his empire would haunt the imagination of European rulers for 1,000 years. Otto the Great would resurrect the title, creating the Holy Roman Empire, a direct attempt to claim Charlemagne's legacy. Napoleon would see himself as the new Charlemagne. The very project of European unification in our own time is a distant echo of his. He lost the battle for his dynasty, but he won the war for the soul of a continent. He was a man of his brutal age, a warlord who imposed peace with a sword and faith with terror. But his vision transcended his methods. He was the barbarian who resurrected Rome, the warrior who championed learning, the conqueror who laid the foundation for a civilization. His ghost still walks the corridors of European power, a perpetual reminder that history is not shaped by abstract forces but by the will, the vision, and the violence of extraordinary individuals. He built his empire on blood and iron, but dreamed of order and enlightenment. His actions gave birth to modern Europe, but his methods were cruel. Looking back across the centuries, what is his ultimate legacy? Was he a ruthless tyrant who united peoples by force, or a visionary builder who laid the foundations of Western civilization? Write your answer in the comments.